Debate. The honourable member for South Okanagan West Kootenay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm happy to speak here today in favour of motion M177, supporting flight training schools across Canada. The member from Kelowna Lake Country represents a neighbouring riding to mine, and I respect his history as a pilot in our armed forces. My father also served in the Air Force, so I kind of share that tradition. Motion M177 would instruct the Standing Committee on Transport, Infrastructure and Communities to undertake a study of flight training schools in Canada and be mandated to first identify the challenges that flight schools are facing in providing trained pilots to industry, and to determine whether the infrastructure available to flight schools meets the needs of the schools and the communities where they are located, and that the committee present its final report no later than 7 months after the adoption of this motion. So to begin with, I, like many of the people here, have several flight schools in my riding. Two of them are, I have standard flight schools in Penticton and Grand Forks, where you can get your flight license. And for over 40 years, Selkirk College in Castlegar had an aviation program teaching flight skills, but unfortunately that program closed in 2014. And the reason for this closure are diverse, but I'm sure if this motion passes and the Transport Committee takes on this important subject, they would do well to hear from Selkirk College to get some insight into the challenges that program faced and why it was forced to close. But I'd like to spend much of my time today talking about a unique flight training school in my riding, a very successful school, a school called HNZ Top Flight. HNZ is one of the premier helicopter flight training schools in the world, and I'd like to start with some of its history, as I think it's really interesting history. The story of HNZ Top Flight began just after the Second World War in 1947, when 3 RCAF veterans joined forces to form a small company called Okanagan Air Services based in Penticton. The company consisted of pilots Carl Ager and Barney Bent and mechanic Alf Stringer. They bought a Bell 47 helicopter and offered crop dusting services to farmers and orchardists in southern British Columbia. Now, I want to mention here, because I didn't really know this before I started researching this speech, and I thought it very interesting that helicopter flight was very new at the time. Igor Sikorsky, in fact, had only invented the first truly functioning helicopter in 1941. Another company, Bell, brought the first commercially available helicopter, the Bell 47, to market in 1946, and Okanagan Air Services was one of their first customers. After a year or two of working exclusively as crop dusting operation, Okanagan Air Services expanded to work in topographical surveys, timber cruising, and mineral exploration. They serviced the Palisade Lake Dam project in 1949, and then in the early 50s they really spread their wings, or their rotors, I guess, and helped build the massive Camano hydroelectric project. For that, they bought a couple of huge Sikorsky helicopters, bought them from Igor Sikorsky himself, to add to their growing fleet of Bell 47s. And realizing that helicopters were really the future of aviation for many transportation, industrial, and military applications, they changed their name to Okanagan Helicopters. By 1955, they had 90 employees. By 1958, they owned 54 helicopters. They were the largest helicopter operator in the world, and they continue to grow, expanding around the world. In 1987, Okanagan Helicopters was bought by Craig Dobbin of St. John's, Newfoundland, who combined their operations with a couple of other helicopter companies to form Canadian Helicopters. And just as an aside, I just want to mention that I had the opportunity to meet Craig Dobbin once when I was driving a Memorial University Jeep down to Cape St. Mary's, almost a four-wheel drive road, and up drove this brown Cadillac, and I had broken down, and Craig helped me out by driving me to the lighthouse where I was living. So I had that little interaction with him. Now, recently, a reunion of the company in Osoyoos, British Columbia, attracted 250 people from around the world. But back to training. In 1951, Carl Ager and Barney Bent began training pilots in Penticton through a subsidiary company that eventually became known as the Canadian Helicopter School of Advanced Flight Training. And as a kid growing up on the west bench of Penticton, just above the airport, I remember those early flight training operations, watching those Bell helicopters, basically a glass bubble attached to an open frame of metal girders, land and take off from the grasslands just south of our house. The flight school has been operating continuously in Penticton for more than 60 years. The diverse terrain and variable winds of the Okanagan Valley and the surrounding mountain areas provide flying challenges that are ideal for the study of mechanics of mountain winds and advanced flying techniques. Among the company's many innovations was Agar's bump jump process for high altitude takeoffs. And if you've ever flown helicopters in the mountains, you'll know this technique involves tipping the helicopter over the side of a cliff and waiting until the air is heavy enough for the rotor blades to operate. Quite a feeling. They also invented the monsoon bucket for use in forest fire suppression. The company was rebranded as HNZ Top Flight after Canadian Helicopters bought HNZ, a New Zealand company. Flight training at HNZ not only includes advanced mountain flying, but also emergency auto-rotation training and night training with and without night vision goggles. Now, over the years, HNZ Top Flight has trained thousands of pilots. The school is known for providing training to government, military, and special forces, law enforcement, commercial, and private groups from all over the world, and the instructors are rightfully proud of the school's heritage. Over 300 students pass through the school each year, and their activities generate a big boost to the local economy in the South Okanagan. The company generates over $8 million per year in direct revenue, but the spin-offs are considerable, including more than 3,000 hotel nights per year. And HNZ Top Flight is a good community citizen. One of the most popular charity auction items in town are the scenic flights they offer, often combined with a gourmet picnic on an alpine mountaintop catered by one of the local restaurants. Much of HNZ Top Flight's training takes place in the spectacular mountains southwest of Penticton, much of which is in provincial protected areas, primarily the Snowy protected area, but also the South Okanagan Grasslands protected area. And HNZ must obtain permits to operate in these areas to ensure their activities do not negatively impact local wildlife populations. These permitting processes are thorough, and the company is in the process right now of spending $300,000 on a study to back up an application for a 10-year operating permit in these areas. The company has concerns that a proposal to convert the South Okanagan Grasslands protected area to a national park would impact their operations. Parks Canada has assured them verbally that previous provincial permits would be honored and future permitting processes would be similar, but until those promises are on paper, that concern will linger. And I'd like to mention now that there are a few downsides to having a successful flight training school in your backyard. One of the obvious ones, and this goes for many flight training schools across the country, is the noise coming from the repetitive takeoff and landings that take place around the airport day after day. And Penticton Airport is relatively small, although it does have scheduled flights through Canada, Air Canada and WestJet, but there are over 10,000 aircraft movements every year from the airport, and many of these involve the takeoff and landings by flight schools. And these repeated flights are of concern to many citizens who live in the area around the airport. And I can attest that having a helicopter over your house in the middle of the night does cause some concern, wondering if you're groggy state, whether the special forces are landing in your backyard, or whether it's just rained in the night and the local cherry orchards need a blow dry. These are serious issues in some small communities with large flight schools and must be addressed through proper planning processes involving government at all levels, including Transport Canada. Now, the NDP has proposed an amendment to this motion asking the committee to also study the effects of noise pollution on community members, and I would obviously support that amendment. But to conclude, Mr. Speaker, it's clear from this debate that Canada needs more pilots in all sectors, and if this motion can help us reduce that problem, I'm happy to support it. Thank you.